The French President Emmanuel Macron and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, are in Beijing, where they're holding talks with the Chinese leadership. The trip is the latest push by Europe to engage with China, and they're expected to urge China to use its influence on Russia to halt the war in Ukraine. After meeting with China's Premier Li Qiang, President Macron has met President Xi Jinping in the last half hour. In his first comments, Mr. Macron said the visit would focus on economic ties as well as international stability. Well, joining us now from our newsroom is our Asia-Pacific editor, Michael Bristow. Michael, thanks very much for being with us. Tell us, how significant is this meeting?
Well, it's very significant. I mean, you just see there, you've seen pictures of the pomp and ceremony of this welcoming Xi Jinping has given President Macron of France, and it starts their meeting with something of optimism. President Macron said earlier, as you indicated there in his meetings with the Chinese Premier Li Qiang, President Macron said this was a chance for France, for European nations to reset their relationship, re-engage with China following 3 years of pandemic, because it's worth remembering, it's worth mentioning that China over the last 3 years has been essentially closed to the outside world. Of course, people have still been talking, but there's a difference between talking on the phone or on Zoom calls and actually meeting people in person. So President Macron said earlier that he hopes that he will be able to, in these face-to-face meetings with Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, re-engage really and on those issues that you mentioned there, the critical one, the war in Ukraine, trying to persuade Xi Jinping to use his influence with President Putin to try and stop the fighting.
Michael, that's what Europe is looking for. What does China want to get out of this meeting?
Well, China, because of the pandemic, because of the lockdowns, the mass testing, the real disruption it's caused to the Chinese economy over the last 3 years, it's had a real damaging effect on economic growth. And remember, economic growth in China is vital for the Chinese Communist Party, because that's how they base their legitimacy. Chinese people have got used to, year after year, seeing their living standards rise. And so the Chinese leader who wanted to focus on the economy, encouraging investment from foreign countries such as France, and increasing trade as export markets for Chinese goods. That's going to be his focus. He's not really going to want to talk, I would imagine, too much about the war in Ukraine, or at least he'll not want to. He'll want to try and rebuff any suggestions that it should change its stance, because of course China's in many respects quite allied to Russia and has given Russia some support.
Michael, as you mentioned, their relations between China and Russia are relatively friendly. They've talked about their relationship having no limits. Do we anticipate that maybe China will slightly turn its back on Russia in favour of the European Union?
No, not really. China, and Xi Jinping in particular, some years ago, has made the calculated decision that it's in China's strategic interest to align itself with Russia, and that's because of the long-term battle it sees coming and already here with the United States. An alliance with Russia is a bulwark against the United States and what China sees as Western-led, US-led institutions, global institutions. And so Xi Jinping has made up his mind some years ago, and I don't think President Macron is going to change his mind.
OK, Michael Bristow, our Asia-Pacific editor, thanks very much for joining us.